There are undoubtedly defining junctures in life, critical instances when one grasps that the meticulously assembled code of conduct of civilized existence is simply discarded. Discovering your home, your personal haven, the very place into which you had invested your financial resources and emotional energy taken over by the single individual on earth whose presence alone feels like a direct insult. All while you are stationed thousands of miles distant in service to your nation. Yes, that most certainly qualifies as one of those junctures. The absolute, unmitigated nerve of it still causes my anger to flare just recalling it. How did I, Captain John Breener, a platoon leader in the United States Army, end up in the thoroughly unbelievable predicament of orchestrating a tactical recovery of my own suburban 3-bedroom, 2-bath residence from an abusively controlling HOA president named, as you might predict, Karen? It is a narrative so peculiar, so astonishingly absurd that even I occasionally find it hard to accept it transpired and I was a direct participant. So, prepare yourselves because this account is quite extraordinary. Prior to the upheaval, there was a period of relative quiet, or what approximated quiet, in a residential area dominated by the unyielding authority of Mrs. Karen Weatherby, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I had acquired my house approximately 2 years earlier. It was a pleasant, modest dwelling with a respectable yard for a dog I did not yet own. Conveniently situated near the base, yet distant enough to allow a sense of civilian life on weekends. It was ideal, or rather, it would have been were it not for Karen. My initial confrontation with her was typical. My lawn was, to quote the precisely typed notification, complete with an ominous red border 3/4 of an inch in excess of the community standard maximum height of 3 inches. I had just returned from an arduous 72-hour field exercise. I was fatigued, unclean, and the aesthetic preferences of the HOA were the furthest thing from my thoughts. I mowed it the following day, but the underlying tension had been established. Karen, a woman who appeared to have starched her entire disposition along with her costly yet invariably somewhat ill-matched designer leisure attire, policed Oakwood Estates in her gleaming white Cadillac Escalade as if it were her personal fiefdom. Her husband, Gerald, a perpetually anxious-looking man who always seemed to be 3 paces behind her, clutching a clipboard and a tape measure, was her silent, enabling accomplice. She possessed a smile that never reached her eyes and a patronizing tilt of her head when she spoke to you as though addressing an especially slow-witted child. She was, to put it succinctly, a torment, but one I deemed manageable at the time. Irritating, certainly. A justification for employing tactical responses? Not at that point. Then, the deployment orders arrived, Afghanistan, for a year-long tour. This is an inherent part of the profession, something I willingly committed to. I organized my personal matters, contracted a landscaping service endorsed by a neighbor, ironically, to prevent further lawn-related communications from Karen. Another neighbor, the elderly Mrs. Henderson, consented to watch over the property and retrieve my mail, and I established automatic bill payments. I even dispatched a polite email to the HOA board, Karen included, apprising them of my deployment and furnishing Mrs. Henderson's contact details for any genuine emergencies. I believed I had addressed all potential issues. I was mistaken, profoundly mistaken. The initial few months deployed overseas were demanding. Extended days, brief nights, the unceasing thrum of existing in a combat theater. Home seemed an immense distance away, like another world entirely. I would receive sporadic updates from Mrs. Henderson. All is well, dear. The lawn looks splendid. We had a bit of a storm last week, but your house is undamaged. Routine information. Then, approximately 6 months into the tour, the emails ceased. My attempts to call her went directly to voicemail. I surmised she might be traveling or perhaps her old telephone was malfunctioning. I was not excessively worried, at least not at first. The shocking news arrived during an infrequent video conversation with my parents. My mother appeared distressed. "John," she began, her voice strained, "we received a call from a Mr. Peterson, one of your neighbors. He indicated he felt we ought to be aware that something peculiar is occurring at your house." Peculiar? What sort of peculiar? My thoughts raced. A burst pipe? A break-in? He said, my father interjected, his expression somber, that it appears someone is residing there. He has observed lights on during the night and vehicles in the driveway that are not yours. Lights on? Vehicles? A chilling sensation settled in my stomach. Whose vehicles? I inquired, endeavoring to maintain a calm, professional tone as I had been trained even as my insides were in turmoil. Well, my mother stated, hesitating, he frequently mentioned a white Escalade. A white Escalade, Karen's signature vehicle. It was inconceivable. It was too preposterous, too audacious. There had to be an error, some misunderstanding. And my father added, his voice tinged with disbelief. He said he observed Karen Weatherb, the HOA president you've spoken of, on your front porch, instructing movers. Movers? A cold dread washed over me. The connection was unstable, the audio intermittent, yet the message was unequivocally clear. Karen Weatherb, the minor despot of lawn maintenance and refuse bin regulations, had evidently resolved to enhance her living arrangements by occupying my house during my deployment. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her actions was astounding. My first response was a moment of stunned quietude, followed by a surge of intense fury that almost caused me to drop the satellite phone. This was not merely an HOA exceeding its authority, this was a hostile seizure of property. I attempted to contact Mrs. Henderson again. Her number still led to voicemail. I telephoned Mr. Peterson, the neighbor who had alerted my parents. He sounded apprehensive, offering apologies for not contacting us earlier. We all just presumed you had rented it out, Captain Breener, he faltered. Mrs. Weatherb informed everyone at an HOA meeting that you had made provisions for her to, house sit for the period of your deployment to guarantee its maintenance according to community standards. It sounded suspicious to some of us, but she possessed some kind of letter. A letter? A counterfeit letter, undoubtedly. My mind was in a whirl. I expressed my gratitude to him, my voice constricted with suppressed anger. I needed to verify this information. I required direct observation. I telephoned the one individual I knew would act without delay, my friend Mike, who resided a few towns away. Mike, I said, I need a significant favor. I need you to drive past my house immediately and report precisely what you observe. He posed few questions, merely discerning the urgency in my tone. An hour later, he called back. Bro, he stated, his voice uncharacteristically grave, you are not going to appreciate this. There is unquestionably someone living there. Lights are on, curtains are closed, and yes, that white Escalade is parked squarely in your driveway as if it belongs there. I saw a woman fitting your description of Karen fussing with some new potted plants on your porch. The anger solidified into a frigid, unyielding determination. This was not merely an act of injustice, it was a profound personal infringement. I was defending liberty thousands of miles from home while this suburban autocrat was effectively commandeering my life. My initial calls were to the local police department. I detailed the circumstances, stressing that I was an active duty soldier deployed overseas. The desk sergeant expressed sympathy but was ultimately unhelpful. Well, sir, if she has established residency, even if fraudulently, it becomes a civil issue. You will need to evict her through the court system. Civil issue? I was sputtering. She is a trespasser. She illegally entered my house. Do you have evidence of that, sir? Or proof that she lacks a lease, regardless of how she acquired it? I did not. Not at that moment. Not from Afghanistan. The mechanisms of justice, I was rapidly discovering, operate with extreme slowness, particularly when one is situated on the opposite side of the globe. I attempted to reach the other HOA board members. Most of their numbers, conveniently, went directly to voicemail or were disconnected. The one member I managed to contact, a timid-sounding treasurer named Arthur, stammered something about Karen having managed all the details and having assured the board that everything was legitimate. He sounded utterly intimidated by her. It became distressingly apparent. Karen governed the HOA like her private syndicate, and the board members were either complicit or coerced into silence. My frustration was escalating to a perilous level. I was a soldier, trained to address hostile entities and secure objectives. My residence had been invaded, and the system intended to safeguard me was proving inadequate. I felt powerless, an emotion I deeply detested. This HOA president had not merely overstepped. She had annihilated the boundary, metaphorically celebrating on the remnants with her gaudy designer footwear. Little did she realize, she was not confronting some compliant civilian. She was confronting a man who commanded a platoon of highly proficient, fiercely devoted soldiers. And she was on the verge of discovering the implications of that. The notion began as a faint spark, a wild, implausible concept. Yet, the more obstacles I encountered, the more that spark intensified into a resolute, burning conviction. If the established system would not provide aid, I would have to resort to self-help. The ensuing few weeks were an exercise in extreme compartmentalization. During the day, I led my men, concentrated on the mission, and performed my duties. At night, sustained by tepid coffee and an acute sense of injustice, I transformed into an investigator, a strategist, a man fixated on reclaiming his dwelling. My foremost objective was intelligence gathering. Karen Weatherbeebe had committed a significant miscalculation. She had misjudged me, and she had misjudged the strength of loyalties that transcend the confines of a war zone. I initiated the process by utilizing my emergency leave request. My CO, a decent man who had encountered his share of peculiar circumstances, listened to my account with a combination of incredulity and empathy. He could not officially authorize any unorthodox measures, but he expedited my leave, granting me a crucial 2-week window to return to the United States and resolve this predicament. While the administrative procedures were underway, I conferred with my platoon. I issued no direct orders, naturally, but during a subdued moment in the rec tent, I presented the situation to my platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Marcus Sarge Jackson, and a couple of my reliable squad leaders, Staff Sergeant Diaz and Sergeant Miller. These men were not merely soldiers under my authority. They were my comrades, individuals with whom I had a bond of mutual trust, having entrusted our lives to one another. Their response was immediate and deeply felt. Sarge, a man typically possessing the emotional expressiveness of a stone monument, actually struck the table with his fist. That which, he growled, a sentiment echoed, though with more colorful language by Diaz and Miller. Sir, Diaz interjected, his eyes gleaming, just inform us of your needs. We have your back. Miller, a reserved specialist with a remarkable aptitude for electronics, added, I can likely retrieve some public records, ascertain if this Karen has a pattern of such irrational behavior. And retrieve them he did. Miller, employing methods that were perhaps best left unexamined, began unearthing digital trails. It emerged that Karen Weatherb had a history of lawsuits filed against her from prior neighborhoods, primarily minor HOA disagreements, but 1 or 2 hinted at property line violations and confrontational tactics. Nothing of this magnitude, but a discernible pattern of arrogant, bullying conduct. She and her husband, Gerald, also presented some financial ambiguities. A pair of unsuccessful businesses, several outstanding liens. Suddenly, occupying a mortgage-free house owned by a deployed soldier might have appeared as a highly tempting, albeit thoroughly illegal, resolution to their difficulties. Meanwhile, back in the States, my friend Mike served as my indispensable source of information and observation. He commenced discreet drive-bys at various hours, noting Karen's daily patterns. She typically departed around 9 a.m., usually in the Escalade, frequently accompanied by Gerald, and would return in the late afternoon. She was receiving mail and packages. She had even, according to Mike, installed new, more ornate curtains in my living room window. The effrontery. He also succeeded in speaking with a few additional neighbors. Mrs. Henderson, it transpired, had been intimidated into silence. Karen had evidently accosted her, brandishing a vaguely official-looking document which Mrs. Henderson, in her 80s and easily discomposed, had not disputed, asserting that I had designated Karen as my official caretaker. Karen had then informed Mrs. Henderson that her assistance was no longer required and that any meddling would result in legal action from the HOA. The elderly woman was petrified. However, another neighbor, a younger man named Ben residing across the street, was incensed. He had harbored suspicions from the outset. He had witnessed the movers and Karen supervising them. He began capturing photographs and brief video recordings on his phone, Karen authoritatively directing a perplexed-looking lawn service crew in my yard, Gerald laboring to carry oversized shopping bags from upscale retailers into my house. She's behaving as if she owns the premises, man, Ben informed me during a crackly international call. Hosts these small garden gatherings. Boasts about her recently acquired property. It's sickening. This was invaluable. Photographic proof. Eyewitness testimonies. Ben even managed to capture an image of the letter Karen had apparently displayed to others. He had observed her showing it to another inquisitive neighbor. He was unable to get near enough to read it distinctly, but it was printed on what appeared to be inexpensive letterhead bearing a clearly falsified signature that bore no resemblance to mine. Progress on the legal front remained exasperatingly slow. I had succeeded in engaging an attorney remotely, a capable woman named Miss Davies, referred by a JAG officer. She was horrified by the circumstances but corroborated what the police had indicated. Eviction was a protracted procedure, and Karen, by virtue of having moved in and established some semblance of fraudulent occupancy, would contest it. Miss Davies elaborated that it could extend for months, even considering my deployment status. Judges are hesitant to grant summary evictions if any uncertainty exists, however fabricated, she explained. Months. I lacked months. I possessed a 2-week leave opportunity and an intense longing to see Karen Weatherb's gaudy throw pillows deposited on my front lawn. Miss Davies did offer one piece of practical guidance, however. Captain Breener, she advised, while a formal eviction process is lengthy, asserting your rights as the homeowner is paramount. If you can peacefully regain possession, considering she is indeed a trespasser who gained access through fraudulent means, her legal basis for re-entry becomes substantially diminished. The onus of proof would then fall heavily upon her. Regain peaceful possession. That particular phrase resonated with me. The definition of peaceful, perhaps, was subject to interpretation. My platoon, bless their devoted hearts, had already begun to refer to the impending operation as Operation Reclaim Homestead. Sarge, Diaz, and Miller, along with a few other trusted members of my platoon who were also scheduled for leave around the same period, had volunteered to help with the move-out. Their concept of assistance likely entailed more direct approaches than Miss Davies foresaw, but the fundamental premise was valid. I was the lawful owner. Karen was an unlawful occupant, a thief. She had seized my home through deception and coercion. The more information I gathered, the more audacious her conduct seemed. She had, naturally, changed the locks. Mike verified this when he attempted to use my spare key at my behest without success. She had submitted a change of address form for my mail, a federal crime. Miller, with his digital sleuthing, discovered she had even attempted to transfer the utilities into her name, though fortunately my deployed status and pre-existing payment arrangements had impeded those particular efforts for some services. She was methodically attempting to expunge me from my own existence. The escalation was undeniable. This was not merely about a dwelling, it concerned a matter of principle. It concerned confronting a bully who preyed upon individuals she deemed defenseless. And she had chosen the incorrect soldier to antagonize. The strategy began to materialize, not within a lawyer's office, but in the manner soldiers strategize: objective, resources, plan of action, backup plans. My objective was straightforward: Karen out, myself in. The peaceful possession aspect was crucial. I sought no physical confrontation, no arrests, at least not my own. I intended to enter my house with overwhelming, irrefutable authority and inform Miss Karen Weatherb that her prolonged, unwelcome sojourn was concluded. The return flight to the United States was the most protracted 14 hours of my existence. Each minute felt like an age, my thoughts fixated on the plan, on Karen's conceited expression, on the image of her Escalade in my driveway. My CO had successfully arranged for me, Sarge, Diaz, and Miller to be on the same transport for the initial segment of the journey, a fortuitous circumstance that permitted some final, discreet strategy discussions. We were not plotting anything unlawful, I reiterated this to myself and to them. We were orchestrating an assertion of property rights, a very resolute, very clear assertion. The concept of force that kept replaying in my mind was the force of our presence, the force of righteousness, the force of several highly competent individuals who excelled at appearing intimidating when necessary. Miss Davies had equipped me with a substantial binder filled with documents: my deed, mortgage statements, utility bills in my name, my deployment orders, copies of the photographs Ben had captured, and a sworn affidavit from Mrs. Henderson. Once Mrs. Henderson knew I was returning and that Karen's period of intimidation was potentially concluding, she had regained her courage. The binder also contained a strongly worded letter from Miss Davies herself, detailing Karen's illegal occupation and demanding immediate relinquishment of the premises. This binder was both my defense and my means of attack. The platoon members who had volunteered, 8 of them in total who managed to align their leave schedules, were my reinforcements. They were not in uniform, naturally, just 8 physically fit, resolute-looking men in civilian attire. Yet, soldiers possess a certain demeanor, a quiet intensity, even when off-duty, that typically discourages disputes. We landed, cleared customs, and I proceeded directly to a rental car agency, securing a large van with ample space for personnel and, hopefully, Karen's hastily packed possessions. My initial destination was a locksmith. I explained the circumstances: locked out of my own house by an unlawful occupant while deployed. I presented my ID and my deed. He was a robust former Marine, and his eyes narrowed with comprehension and a degree of grim contentment. "Captain," he stated, "call me when you arrive. I'll be on standby. We will get you into your house, one way or another. No fee for a fellow serviceman being exploited like this." His backing provided a small but meaningful boost to my morale. Next, a brief meeting with Ben, the neighbor. He provided the latest intelligence. Karen was at home, her Escalade in the driveway. He had also, commendably proactive, contacted a couple of other supportive neighbors, informing them of my return and my intention to confront Karen. They were prepared to act as witnesses, to offer assistance if required, and, I suspected, to relish the spectacle. One of them was an off-duty sheriff's deputy, a potentially very advantageous connection. The plan was direct, almost military in its elegance. Phase 1, approach and secure. We would arrive, I would attempt to use my key, fully aware it would not work. Then, the locksmith would perform his task. The instant that door was opened, I would enter my house, reclaiming possession. Phase 2, confront and evict. I would present Karen with the legal documents and the irrefutable reality of my presence. My men would accompany me, silent and watchful, conveying a clear message that this was not a matter for negotiation. Phase 3, removal. Karen would be directed to collect her personal belongings and depart immediately. Any opposition would be met with a call to the police, with whom the off-duty deputy neighbor had already agreed to liaise if necessary, explaining the situation from a position of legal authority, homeowner reclaiming property from a trespasser. We gathered a block from my house. My heart was racing, a concoction of adrenaline, fury, and a potent protective urge. This was the decisive moment. I observed Sarge, Diaz, Miller, and the other 5 soldiers, good men, utterly loyal. They were not present for violence, they were present because they believed in justice and they believed in me. All right, I said, my voice low and composed, let's be perfectly clear. I will do the talking. You gentlemen are merely my very convincing moving crew. We remain calm. We remain professional. She is the one at fault here. Let her be the one to lose composure. We document every action. Diaz had his phone prepared to record, Miller had a compact high-definition camera. We traversed the final block, parking directly behind Karen's gleaming white Escalade, effectively trapping it. The sight of that pretentious vehicle in my driveway, an emblem of her insolence and sense of privilege, sent a renewed surge of anger through me. It was time for action. I walked up my own front walkway, the path for which I had personally poured the concrete one sweltering summer weekend. The frilly new curtains in the window felt like a personal affront. My men positioned themselves slightly behind me, a formidable sight. I inhaled deeply and rang the doorbell I had installed. The wait was agonizingly brief. The door opened and there she stood, Karen Weatherb in person, in my foyer. She was attired in a silk kimono-style robe that likely cost more than my monthly mortgage installment. A smug, self-contented look adorned her face, which wavered slightly upon seeing me. Then her gaze shifted past me to the group of rather large, unimpressed-looking men standing on my lawn. Her meticulously shaped eyebrows rose. Well, she commenced, her voice laden with condescension, though a note of apprehension had surfaced. What is this? Some form of coercive tactic? Before she could unleash a characteristic Karen outburst, I interjected, my voice composed but frigid. Karen, I stated, displaying my military ID and the substantial binder of documents, this is Captain John Breener. This is my residence. You are trespassing. Your prolonged, unauthorized occupancy is concluded. You must depart now. Karen Weatherb's expression underwent a remarkable series of changes over approximately 10 seconds. Initially, bewilderment, as if she could not fully comprehend my actual physical presence. Then, a hint of what might have been apprehension as her eyes scanned Sarge and the others who stood silently, arms casually folded, appearing utterly resolute. This rapidly transformed into feigned indignation. How dare you, she shrieked, her voice escalating several decibels. I possess an agreement, Elise. You cannot simply force your way in here. She gestured vaguely behind her as if a mystical lease document might magically appear. Truly, Karen? I responded, my voice remaining steady, though the effort was considerable. I advanced a step into the entryway of my home. She instinctively attempted to obstruct me, placing her hands on the doorframe. You are not entering here. Actually, I declared, I am. This was the critical juncture. I glanced towards Sarge, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. That was the only confirmation I required. I had no intention of physically harming her, but neither was I going to be prevented from entering my own property. Karen, I asserted, you have 2 alternatives. You can either step aside and permit me, the lawful proprietor of this residence, to enter, or I can have the locksmith, who is currently waiting down the street, open my door. Regardless, I am entering, and believe me, the latter choice will be significantly more humiliating for you when the neighbors witness it. Her gaze darted to the street, then back to me, then to the stoic faces of my men. Her assurance was visibly diminishing, supplanted by a sharp, vindictive anger. "I am summoning the police," she shrieked, fumbling for a phone presumably concealed in a pocket of her costly robe. "Please proceed," I responded, nearly smiling. "In fact, my neighbor, Deputy Miller from the Sheriff's Department, is already informed of the circumstances and is en route to facilitate a peaceful resolution. He also possesses copies of my ownership documents." That appeared to halt her completely. The mention of an actual law enforcement officer, one unlikely to be swayed by her typical bluster, clearly unsettled her. Her hand paused. Just then, as if by design, the locksmith's van quietly pulled up behind our rental vehicle. He alighted, tool bag in hand, and gave me a thumbs up. Concurrently, Ben and a couple of other neighbors materialized on their lawns, observing with unconcealed curiosity. The off-duty deputy, a composed, authoritative man in civilian attire, approached and stood nearby watching. The pressure on Karen was intensifying from every direction. She appeared ensnared, her eyes flitting about like those of a trapped creature. Her husband, Gerald, abruptly materialized behind her, looking pallid and frightened. He had evidently been eavesdropping. She turned back to me, her features distorted. "You cannot do this. I have rights. You have the right to collect your personal items and depart from my property without delay," I corrected. "Every minute you linger, you compound your legal difficulties. Trespassing, fraudulent misrepresentation, it's a considerable list. Karen, my attorney, Miss Davies, whose letter I trust you received but opted to disregard, is very eager to address this with you in court." I held up the binder once more. "This contains my deed, my mortgage, my military orders, an affidavit from your intimidated neighbors, photographs of your unlawful occupation, and proof of your forged documents. Would you care to examine it?" She gazed at the binder as though it were a poisonous serpent. The defiance was visibly draining from her. Her shoulders sagged. The silk robe suddenly seemed less an emblem of authority and more like a pitiable costume. Gerald was tugging at her arm, whispering urgently. Finally, with a sound that was a cross between a sob and a snarl, she conceded, "Fine, but you will be hearing from my lawyer." "I genuinely hope I do," I retorted, stepping entirely into my foyer. Sergeant Diaz positioned himself smoothly beside the doorway, not in a threatening manner, but with an unmistakable implication. There would be no re-entry once she departed. "You have 1 hour to retrieve your personal belongings," I informed her. "My men will, assist you in accelerating that process by transporting your items to the curb. Anything remaining after 1 hour will be deemed abandoned property." Her jaw slackened. 1 hour? That is unfeasible. I have furniture, clothing, my collection of artisanal scented spires. I am not exaggerating. That is what she termed her absurdly oversized candles. 1 hour, Karen, I reiterated firmly. The clock is ticking. And thus commenced the most gratifying eviction I could ever have conceived. Karen, veering between shrill commands directed at Gerald and muttered threats, began frantically attempting to pack. My men, with surprising swiftness and a noticeable lack of delicacy, started relocating items. Boxes of what appeared to be new attire, still bearing tags. Kitchen appliances I had never seen. Ghastly decorative pillows that affronted my military decorum. It all began to accumulate on my front lawn. Each item removed felt like a minor triumph, a fragment of my life being restored. Karen attempted to dispute ownership of a hideous foam marble coffee table. "That's a designer piece," she lamented. Sarge, without uttering a word, lifted it with one hand and carried it outside. The expression on her face was invaluable. The neighbors observed, some overtly, others peeking through their curtains. There was an evident sense of collective contentment. The dominion of Queen Karen was definitively concluded. The police did eventually arrive, summoned by a frantic Karen. The deputy neighbor conversed quietly with them, presenting my documentation. They listened patiently to Karen's agitated, rambling version of events, then calmly advised her that this was indeed a civil dispute she would need to address through the courts. However, as she was not the homeowner and possessed no valid lease, she was required to vacate the premises as requested by me, the actual owner. They remained to ensure order, which primarily consisted of observing Karen experience a complete emotional collapse as the last of her possessions, including a truly dreadful collection of porcelain cat figurines, were unceremoniously placed on the curb. The white Escalade, once an emblem of her authority, now served as her escape transport, rapidly being loaded with a disorganized assortment of belongings under Gerald's flustered supervision. The hour concluded. Karen, disheveled and vanquished, her silk robe stained, her face streaked with angry tears, glared at me one final time. "You haven't heard the end of this, Captain Breener," she seethed. "Oh, I rather suspect I have, Karen," I responded, permitting myself a slight, firm smile. And then she departed, the Escalade speeding away from the curb, leaving a small mound of her rejected life on my lawn. I stood in my doorway, flanked by my men, and inhaled a deep, purifying breath of air that, for the first time in months, genuinely felt like it was mine. My house was mine once more. The immediate aftermath was a flurry of action. Firstly, the locksmith, who had been patiently awaiting, commenced changing every single lock on the premises. "Can't be too cautious with that sort," he muttered, expertly disassembling the old hardware Karen had presumably installed. While he worked, my men conducted a swift inspection of the house. It was quite an ordeal. Karen had not merely resided in my house, she had attempted to Karenify it. The frilly curtains were even more objectionable up close. Hideous floral bedspreads covered my beds. My minimalist living room had been inundated with trinkets and scented candles that exuded an aroma akin to a potpourri factory explosion. There were minor scuffs on the walls where she had clearly tried to hang her own artwork. It was an aesthetic offense. We dedicated the next few hours to bagging the remaining refuse Karen had abandoned, mostly rubbish, unwanted periodicals, and a surprising quantity of empty wine bottles. The heap on the curb expanded further, a testament to her audacity. Ben and the other neighbors approached, offering assistance and congratulations. A celebratory mood pervaded, resembling a small-scale liberation day for Oakwood Estates. Mrs. Henderson even baked a pie, her relief evident. "Oh, John, I am so delighted you've returned," she exclaimed, her eyes bright. That woman was a menace. The off-duty deputy clapped me on the shoulder. "Well executed, Captain. Sometimes one must counter force with rifle force." The repercussions for Karen were swift and, from my viewpoint, profoundly gratifying. The narrative of her hostile occupation and subsequent forced eviction disseminated through the neighborhood rapidly. The HOA board, finally liberated from her oppressive influence and likely apprehensive about being implicated in her fraudulent dealings, convened an emergency meeting. Arthur, the previously timid treasurer, seemingly discovered his resolve. He, along with other board members who had been coerced or intimidated by Karen, presented a catalog of her abuses of authority, culminating in the unlawful seizure of my home. The letter she had brandished, asserting my consent, was readily demonstrated to be a crude fabrication once I furnished the board with authentic samples of my signature and official communications. Within a week, Karen Weatherb was not only removed as HOA president but also summarily expelled from the board entirely. Her dominion had ended. Gerald, her complicit husband, reportedly initiated divorce proceedings shortly thereafter, citing irreconcilable differences and, according to neighborhood speculation, a profound aversion to ever encountering another artisanal scented candle. Legally, Miss Davies was excelling. We initiated civil proceedings against Karen for trespassing, property damage, the expense of new locks, repairing scuffs, and a thorough deep cleaning to exorcise the persistent scent of ocean breeze potpourri, as well as for emotional distress. The evidence was irrefutable. The photographs Ben had taken, Mrs. Henderson's affidavit, the testimonies of the locksmith and the deputy, my own meticulously compiled timeline. Karen stood no chance. Confronted with the likelihood of a very public and humiliating court case, she chose to settle. The sum was not transformative, but it sufficed to cover all my expenditures, compensate me for the violation, and, most crucially, serve as a significant financial deterrent for her conduct. But the definitive proof, the element that truly determined Karen's fate beyond merely losing my house and her HOA leadership, originated from an unforeseen source. During the board's hurried attempts to resolve the disarray Karen had created, Arthur, the treasurer, discovered serious financial discrepancies. It transpired that Karen had not only been power-obsessed but also dishonest with funds. She had been methodically misappropriating HOA finances for years, small sums intermittently camouflaged as administrative outlays or community enhancement projects that never actually occurred. The occupation of my house, it appeared, might have been partially motivated by a desperate effort to sustain a lifestyle her actual finances could not accommodate, or perhaps she viewed it as another resource to exploit. The board, now under new, more accountable governance, submitted their discoveries to the district attorney. Criminal charges for embezzlement and fraud ensued. The last I heard, Karen Weatherb was confronting considerable prison time, her designer tracksuits likely to be exchanged for something far less stylish. The Oakwood Estates HOA experienced a thorough restructuring. New regulations were established, prioritizing transparency and accountability. The community, unsettled by Karen's audacity, became more involved and watchful. They even, much to my initial hesitation, nominated me for the new HOA board. I initially declined. I had endured enough HOA-related turmoil to last a lifetime. But Sarge, with his characteristic direct wisdom, remarked, "Sir, if decent individuals do not assume responsibility, the Karens of the world will invariably find a way to return." He had a valid argument. Consequently, I served one term, contributed to implementing rational rules, and ensured that authority was distributed rather than consolidated. Reflecting on it, the entire episode still seems incredible. It was an unfortunate convergence of entitlement, audacity, and a complete misjudgment of the person she was confronting. Karen believed she was targeting an absent soldier, an easy victim. She failed to consider his training, his determination, or the steadfast loyalty of his platoon. She failed to anticipate that decent neighbors would ultimately find their courage. The ordeal taught me a great deal about the necessity of vigilance, even in tranquil suburban settings, about the resilience of community when good people unite, and about the profound contentment derived from reclaiming what is rightfully yours from someone who so arrogantly attempted to seize it. My house feels like a home once more, purged of Karen's presence, filled instead with the fellowship of friends and the quiet contentment of justice achieved. The frilly curtains are long gone, supplanted by practical blinds. The prevailing aroma is usually coffee or perhaps gun oil after a cleaning session. Occasionally, while sitting on my porch, I observe a new white Escalade pass by, a different model, a different driver, and I cannot suppress a chuckle. That, in essence, is the story of how my platoon assisted in the eviction of a rogue HOA president from my residence. It was undoubtedly the most unconventional housewarming one could imagine.